So I'm just going to finish my welcome and introduce Dr. Shane Martin, Dean of the School of Education.
And it's certainly my pleasure to welcome all of you as well and to introduce tonight's speaker. Martha McCarthy is the President's Professor in the Department of Educational Leadership in the School of Education. She joined the university in 2011. She came from Indiana University, where she served as a Chancellor's Professor and Chair of the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies in the School of Education. Professor McCarthy's research is primarily in educational law and policy, and the evolution and reform of educational leadership preparation programs. She has conducted research on most aspects of educational law, focusing recently on First Amendment issues pertaining to church-state relationships and expression rights of students and school employees. Professor McCarthy has served as president of the Education Law Association and the University Council of Educational Administration. Now, I don't know how many living legends you know, but Dr. McCarthy has received the Living Legend Award from the National Council of Professors of Educational Administration, and also the Ronald Campbell Lifetime Achievement Award and the Edwin Briggs Award from the University Council for Education Administration. Now, that may not mean a lot to folks that aren't in this area, but let me tell you, Professor McCarthy is incredibly well recognized by her peers and the major scholarly associations in her area. Tonight she will be speaking about her book, At a Crossroads, the Educational Leadership Professoriate in the 21st Century, co-authored with Dawn Hackman. This research is a national study on leadership preparation programs that examines the educational leadership units and the characteristics, activities, and attitudes on educational leadership faculty members. LMU is just so privileged to have a professor, a scholar of the national, international renown as Professor Martha McCarthy. Please welcome our President's Professor.
Thank you, Shane. I am touched by that wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here. I know it's an incredibly busy time in the semester, so I am very pleased and delighted that you're here. I've been looking forward to this for a year because I was originally scheduled to do this a year ago, and we had to move it because of another School of Ed event. So I'm doubly glad to be here this evening. And another reason that I'm happy to be here to talk about this book is I speak usually on school law topics, and I love that. I'm passionate about the law, but it's really fun to talk about and to kind of get back into the ed leadership literature, and this has been my academic home for over 35 years, and it's very dear to my heart. So I'm kind of doubly glad to be here and talk about this study that we did. Before we start, though, I would like to know, I know some of you, and I see some of my students that are here. I know some of you, but I don't know all of you. How many are not in the area of ed leadership? All right, we have many that aren't. So can you you're in libraries, okay. Other than libraries, what areas do we have represented here? Because it would be good to just kind of know. I saw other hands. Is everybody from the library?
I think we're from Carl Thorpe School. I'm a principal. And
Great.
Leslie's a teacher.
Okay. All right. Well, we own you in ed leadership, so you can't get away from us on that. Others that in other areas, yes.
Well, I'm not a student or a staff member. I live in the neighborhood, and I've lived in the neighborhood for a long time, so I regularly go to these events. But I worked for a long time at one of these smaller non-traditional law schools. So as a mid-level staff person, so I'm familiar with things like accreditation, for example, and familiar with law education.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I'm hoping that those that are not in ed leadership in some way will see the relevance of the data for their respective fields. And what I would like to do is, and by the way, I like to keep it informal, this wonderful room and nice setting. So if you have a question as we go along, or you just want to make a comment or anything else, just break in at any time. That's always my preferred style. So, and this is the book that is the study that I'm going to talk about. This is a book resulting from that. But before getting into that, I would like to talk a little bit about a few assumptions. School leaders matter. They influence student learning. You may say, duh, of course school leaders matter. That's, just self-explanatory. But there are critics that will assert that we don't really need school leaders, that we can just divvy things up among teachers, or we can have business managers that run the schools. We don't really need school leaders. And you can imagine if people are saying we don't need school leaders, what they're saying about those of us that prepare school leaders. They're saying we definitely aren't needed at all. We're superfluous at best, and maybe we're detrimental at worst as far as preparing school leaders, that school districts can prepare their own. Or we can go to for-profit groups that have school leaders prepared that way. So there are critics that say neither of these are very much needed. Fortunately, we are gathering data, and we have some data that show school leaders do matter. They influence student learning second only to teachers. About a quarter of the variance is attributed to school leaders. And we don't have good schools with poor leaders. So they're getting more attention now. They are being included in the reform activities, which wasn't true for quite a while. We're just starting to get some data, tracking back from successful school leaders to what happened in their preparation programs. Just starting to get that. By the way, there'd be some good dissertations out there looking at that. And it's no easy feat. This is not easy to do. But it is so important. We can't refute the critics that leadership preparation isn't needed if we don't have the data to show these elements are linked to successful leaders in school. So we are starting to get a little bit of that data. Another assumption is it's important for every field in higher education periodically to take stock, to look at the programs, look at the students, look at the faculty. What are their activities, characteristics? What are their attitudes? And look at trends over time and see things that need to be changed so that we can make plans for the future. So when I was president of UCEA, that was mentioned by Shane, this was in the mid-'80s, I conducted a study of faculty in our field. It was building on a study that had been done in the early 70s. It seemed like it was time to take stock again. Then in the mid-'90s, I directed another study. In fact, this was the book on the study in the mid-'90s, and then co-directed the one in 2008 that resulted in this book at a crossroads. But we have some pretty rich longitudinal data now over almost a 40-year period that tracks professors, faculty in ed leadership, and programs. Have the programs changed over time? And in fact, the study before continuity and change, we found a lot of things that hadn't changed over time, and some things that had. And I'm going to highlight just a few of the things that have changed during this presentation tonight. And another assumption, and this is primarily for those of you that aren't in ed leadership, that many of the things that have been experienced by the professoriate in our field are very similar to other fields as well. We had the tremendous growth in the 50s and 60s. This was the golden era. The faculty were untouchable. They were, we kept hiring, and that didn't last. Lots of federal funds during that time, but in the 70s, the federal funds started to flatline. We saw retrenchment. We saw consolidation of programs. In my field, in ed leadership, we saw a lot of specialization at that time. So law, there's the law group, the finance group, the politics of education. So we saw all these different subgroups, and a lot of faculty started identifying with the subgroups rather than with the larger group of educational leadership. And there was some criticism saying this really fragmented the field, and that faculty were becoming very academic and they were out of touch with those in the school. So I think that's one reason we're seeing a lot more emphasis now on field connections and on having administrative experience. Certainly the accountability in the 80s and heyday in the 90s with accountability for student learning, accountability for graduation rates. This has really put higher education under the microscope. And we've seen this at K-12 level for a while. But now we're really looking at this as higher ed accountable to its constituents, to those that are paying big bucks to go to school. What are they getting for their degree? And we're seeing a lot of accountability that we did not see before. And then the last bullet on there, this competition outside academia. It's just incredible, particularly from the virtual programs. I mean, there's not a week that goes by that I don't get an email message saying, get your degree in ed leadership sitting at home in 2 weeks. There are some really very good, credible online programs, but some that really are not. And so it's a lot of competition from outside academia, for sure. All right, here are the studies that are being compared, the 4 studies that, again, provide us the longitudinal data. And just a couple of points of context across all of them. Ed leadership, it was a graduate's area of study. We don't have undergraduate programs in ed leadership as they do in many countries. Internationally, we do not. We expect people to have been teachers and have a college degree if they're going to be teachers, and so it's a graduate area of study. The other thing that's very unique about ed leadership, if you compare it to some disciplines in higher education, is being licensure-driven. In that when states started putting licensure requirements in place, this had a tremendous influence on what we offered in our programs. Since state licensure is more similar than different across states, so are the ed leadership programs if you look at the courses that are offered and so on. Now, I have to add that licensure is under fire in some states, and certainly in California this has been true. With the preliminary license, you can get that in California by passing a test. Now, I'm not opposed to testing. And if passing this test means that someone's going to be a competent, moral school leader, I'm all for it. But if it doesn't mean that, passing the test, well, that's a whole other presentation. We'll do that another time. But anyway, licensure is under attack, and so it is interesting to see where we're going to go with that. The third bullet there is just the number of preparation programs has grown. We made every effort to locate all the programs nationally that were providing degrees in ed leadership. There are some that were just providing licensure that we maybe didn't identify, but all that were providing degrees we did try to identify, and we came up with 590 programs. In the study that I did in the mid-'80s, there were 372. There were 125 programs in 1950. Steady increase in the number of programs, and what's so interesting is there have been all kinds of calls to reduce the number of programs, not increase the number. I've been on 2 national commissions that made recommendations that we should have certain quality standards and we should reduce the number of programs nationally. That has not happened. I'll return to this because I think that's one reason we've seen the states get involved in assessing ed leadership programs is because we have not done that ourselves. The other thing that I want to just mention is related to that first bullet there about being a graduate field of study. When we did the study in 2008, about almost 70% of the programs nationally were licensure or master's degree programs. licensure only or master's degree. And about 3% were PhD programs, very small in leadership. 3% were PhD, 15% were EDD programs, which is more the practitioner degree, and the remainder were sixth-year programs, the educational specialist program. So not a whole lot at the doctoral level, but definitely the majority were master's degrees. All right, moving right along. These are our methods. We employed the same approach that was used in the prior studies because we wanted to be able to compare the data over time. Now, obviously, we added some questions. Technology in the mid-'80s wasn't a very big issue. It was a very big issue even in the mid-'90s, but certainly in the current study. So we added some questions to reflect new topics, and we did have open-ended questions as well. Today, I'm going to report primarily descriptive statistics, but we did use some other statistical approaches in analyzing the data as well. And we looked at the data from a variety of standpoints. In fact, the pain came back when I was looking at this, thinking, oh my gosh, why did we divide it up so many different ways? Because we really do have a lot of data here. But we looked at the faculty respondents by sex, by race. We looked at them as far as the type of institution where they were employed. And I want to pause here for a moment because the Carnegie system changed its classification scheme between two studies. So we literally went to every institution involved, looking at it, where was it in the first scheme, where was it in the second, to try to be sure we were comparable, that we were comparing appropriately across the studies. And what we ended up doing is using the research classification of research institutions, the doctoral granting, and then the new scheme uses masters, large masters, and then it has several different. We combine those because we don't have programs that go much below that because, again, they're all graduate programs, but they were called comprehensive institutions in the scheme before, so you'll hear me kind of use those terms interchangeably a bit. Length of time in academia, we have the novice, 5 years or less, the veterans over 11 years, and those that were in between. We looked at experience as a school administrator, and that was a biggie because from the study in the mid-'90s to the study in 2008, it went from 1/3 of the faculty had administrative experience to 2/3 had administrative experience. So there are a lot of implications there for the kinds of programs that you have. Type of position, tenure line or clinical, and again, that was a big jump from the 90s, 1% in clinical, and we're looking at full-time faculty. Clinical roles to 16%. Big jump there. And then affiliation with the two major associations that, again, Shane mentioned, UCEA, which is institutional membership, and there were about 80 UCA members at the time we did the study. There are more now because they have actually included some international universities as UCEA members, but at the time of this study in 2008, that's how many there were. NCPEA, both of these, their names are a mouthful. I don't know why they have these long names, but I'm just going to use the acronyms. NCPEA is individual members, and it's more aligned with the master's programs. UCEA, there was a very direct correlation with the data on UCEA affiliation and research institutions, because about 83% of the UCA institutions are in that category of research institutions. So some of the data that break out by UCEA, you also can assume that would be the same for research institutions. I'm not breaking it out in what I'm showing today by NCPEA membership, just because there were more differences by UCA affiliation. And by the way, if I look a little bleary-eyed, Ellen is applying for UCA membership, and we've been reviewing the materials, and we're very hopeful. It's a great proposal, and I can say that because others have really worked so hard on it. But anyway, so we're hoping that we will be a member of that group soon. All right. Let's see. Okay, let's start off with one of the major findings in 2008. Look at that data. Female representation. 2% of the ed leadership faculty in 72, 45% in 2008. That's just huge difference. And I can tell you, when I joined the ed leadership professoriate, the few women we could literally meet in a phone booth. The 5 or 6 of us nationally got to be really good friends. And in fact, there's a book that came out last year on the first generation women in ed leadership programs. And I have to say, the chapter I did, that was the quickest thing I ever wrote. But so it really has been absolutely dramatic. Minority representation has increased 5-fold since 72, but it's not anything as dramatic as the increase in female representation. So what I'd like to do, I'd like you to just take a minute or two, talk with someone near you, see what you think the implications of this change in demographics. And by the way, first time when we got the data in 2008, that Caucasian males were not majority of ed leadership faculty. 49%. They were close, but they were not a majority. First time since we've been gathering data. So just take a minute or two, talk to somebody, see what implications. I'm just curious what you come up with.
Majority of teaching but now
It's got to be.
It's still low. It's still low, but it's not
a higher percentage have been teachers. The faculty have been teachers, so that would be where have more women plan to go into administration and then go higher education or higher education. I'm kind of surprised by the decline of male. I think it's are men leaving the profession. So this is
But let's come back together. What did you think of? What are some of the implications for ed leadership programs with this kind of change in representation? Do you have any thoughts on what that might mean for the programs? Anything you say.
Well, we thought that, even though your point about the increase of the minority faculty of color is a 5-fold increase, the 15% still seems low, although particularly to us in Los Angeles in our context.
But you don't live in North Dakota.
Right, other parts of the country, So that's one thing that stood out to us. And then what is that? And then how does that reflect the students that are in the programs as well as the students at the schools?
Yeah. And it is, when you look at nationally, the degrees that students get, about 65% of the degrees now are awarded to women. And trust me, again, when I entered the field, that wasn't true. We had one female in the first cohort that I worked with. So that changed dramatically as well. About 25% are to students of color. And if you look, this shows the recent hires in the last 10 years. And by the way, the first 2 studies I worked on, it was a big difference with the percentage of women and faculty of color in the recent hires versus those that were, everybody that was employed. Not so for women in the 2008 study because they had almost reached parity. They had 45%. But even looking at the UCEA programs, 57%, that's approaching how many are getting graduate degrees. So UCA programs and research institutions are hiring now more women than they are men. UCA, 30% of faculty of color. That's more than the percentage of degrees that are awarded to students of color in ed leadership. So they're doing pretty well in hiring minority faculty members, at least at research institutions and UCA institutions. And these, again, are the recent hires, the past 10 years. So if we do another study in 10 years, and I think I'm going to let another colleague take over this, but if we do another study, you would expect the currently hired to be a much higher figure given how many are in the recently hired group. Other thoughts about this? Any thoughts about how it might influence the curriculum or the offerings? Yes.
I can understand the excitement as the female as the female percentage goes up. The minority, though, it's stayed pretty even. As a matter of fact, it's dropping. And what I'm looking at. Do you have the breakdown of the minority percentage as far as what minorities are?
What the representation,
Yes.
like African American,
Yes,
Hispanic,
exactly.
we do, and we do have that in here. I don't have it in the slides. And it seemed, again, there's been a steady increase in minority representation, but it just hasn't grown as fast and as much as it has for females in the professorial roles. But we do have that breakdown. There weren't enough in some of the cells to do much analysis with that, but we do have that broken down.
Martha, when you look at females, did you also break it down as to females, white females,
Yes.
minority?
Yes, and same with faculty of color, males and females, whether we have more growth with one than the other. And it seemed like, again, we had more growth with female faculty members of color.
So does that change? That was my question. Does that change the curriculum for the schools themselves
Yeah.
because of the fact that it's going more female oriented?
Yeah, great question. And it's interesting. When I joined the professoriate, the first 15 years that I was at Indiana, I was the only female in the unit. When I left, we had more women than men. Now, only one more, but more women than men in the unit. Neither of those were atypical for a research institution. When I joined, it was very typical that if you had a female, it was one that you had in the unit. And when I left, it was much. We expected, and in fact, we predicted in the study in the 80s, just the point that you were making, because sex was a major distinguishing factor. Women were more research-oriented. Women were less satisfied with the status quo. Women had more problems with their departmental mission and structure. So we thought, as more women came in, they were going to be significant change agents, and this was going to really change the nature of the units. Well, that didn't exactly happen. And I'm just so curious as to know, why did that not happen? We saw the attitudes were much more similar between the men and women in 2008. And you might say, well, of course, because you've got more women now, they come to kind of the mean between the attitudes of the women in the earlier studies and the attitudes of the men. But that's not true. They move more toward the former attitudes of the men.
Because they have to succeed in the environment.
All right, and that's what my question is. Are we hiring women, or are they retaining women that kind of fit in?
Well, I was going to say about curriculum and instruction, it would be interesting to know where women are on the policy stage, because you have a vast majority of states now that have signed on to the Common Core curriculum, which is actually going to direct a lot of curriculum instruction in the future. And so, where are women related to the policy decisions that are being made related to these kinds of standards and so forth? So are they also making gains in state departments of education and,
Sure.
in the political world that affects education.
That affects the education policy. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to look at the policymakers as far as that breakdown. But we were really a little bit surprised because we thought we were going to see this kind of be the impetus for change. Now, if you look at the attitudes and activities of Caucasian versus faculty of color, there's still some pretty significant differences, more so than there are based on sex. The faculty of color more research-oriented. The faculty of color less satisfied with the status quo. Well, will that go the same way? If we increase the ranks, if they get higher, will those come together and will it go more toward the Caucasian? I don't know. So before pinning my hopes that this is going to be the vehicle for change agents, I'm a little more cautious given what happened with the activities and attitudes of the women. But we were somewhat surprised on that, I have to say. Other points, y'all made some great points on this. And again, that just shows you that even currently, that's the current hires, UCA slightly more women than UCA programs. And this is the one that I showed you on the recent hires, which the main thing here is the minority representation, which has increased substantially in the recent hires. All right, what about academic rank? That's another thing that we were a little bit surprised of because in the 3 studies before, heavily professors and heavily tenured, but in the 08 study, much more even across ranks. Much more even across ranks. Now, still, Caucasian males tend to be more at the professor rank. Some of the minority faculty, again, because we have so many recent hires, are more at the assistant rank, but still not anything like it was in the prior studies. And this just shows you the difference here. Professors, over 50% in the prior 2, 27% in this one. So you think, well, we're getting more even, we're getting more new people in. What really surprised us, though, the mean age continued to rise. How could that be? How would we have these assistant professors? So we went in and we looked at the new professors. They're becoming professors at an older age. They're serving as school administrators and then and just think about your own units. That's happening with people coming in after serving as school administrators. So we thought the mean age would be much lower. So even though we have this pretty much, an evenness across the academic ranks, still we're going to have a lot of turnover because we're hiring faculty at an older age, and particularly true of the clinical faculty. They were significantly older than the tenure track. All right, this was a biggie. In the last studies, we didn't analyze the clinical faculty separately because in the one in the mid-90s, we had 1% of the faculty that were clinical. There just weren't enough to really do meaningful analysis. This time we had 16% of the faculty were clinical. So that means we're hiring fewer tenure line faculty, and there were significant differences. Not only were they older, the clinical, more administrative experience, many times that's what they're hired for, their administrative experience, more generalists, leadership in general, not content specialists, law, finance, organizational theory, and so on. They were everybody's satisfied, but they were even more satisfied than the tenure line faculty with their roles, with their programs, less likely to identify issues in the field. Take a minute, talk to somebody. If you talk to somebody different, that would be great, but in some places where you're sitting, you probably can't. Just talk about, what do you think the implications of more clinical faculty? What does this mean for a leadership unit? So just take a minute. Here's your response.
They don't care.
now trying to salary for teaching in a
They're making loads of money.
It's like really experience. Let me tell you about trying to develop a full inclusion school with general ed teachers and special ed teachers.
Yeah, I'm not surprised it's happy because this is oftentimes almost a second. They're not worried about getting tenure. I wish that probably is in line too. I hope people like libraries, like having faculty it's a world of what do I do with my job? What's also they want to see that and so I think the clinical faculty feels valued because making sure that is George too. That's Nessie, George too. Taught at IU. So does he still teach there?
No. He did a lot of higher ed.
Oh, they were okay, so they may have been. He was at IU.
All right, let's go back together. So what do you going to 16% of the faculty being in these clinical, full-time faculty, being in these clinical roles, what do you think? What are implications for our programs, for research, for whatever in our field? Thoughts? Yes.
Well, I received my master's in administration from Pepperdine, and there were a couple that were tenured and doing research, and most of the professors there were clinical. And for practical experience, I really liked the clinical professors because they kind of knew what was going on currently in the schools and were really helpful. But now, being in the doctoral program, I'm thinking, they're not really interested in changing what's going on in the schools. They're kind of more interested in just kind of replacing and getting people to fit in with what's going on in the schools right now. So I think I see positives and negatives to both. But
okay, and it's a lot of people. We'll see both. See the positives and negatives. Did somebody else have that? Oh, were you just stretching? Okay. You don't have any thoughts on the clinical. Now remember, they're more generalists. Leadership in general, definitely more connected to the field, and that's one reason they were hired.
Right.
Because the faculty were being criticized, saying, you're out of touch. You've been teaching law for 20 years in academia. You're out of touch. You haven't been a school administrator in a long time. We need clinical faculty that have recently been in superintendencies or principalships or whatever.
I think it makes perfect sense as the bar around tenure has really risen. The tenure line or the tenure track isn't an appropriate fit for many folks who have spent a first career, as you've said, as a successful school administrator. We need those people in our preparation programs, and so I think this makes the case perfectly for clinical faculty.
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? Yes.
Does that now add to the hierarchy, though, if we have if we have more administrators that are moving into this non-tenured track, do we now have more professors who are now supervising them, and there's now more of a hierarchy? So we're now centralizing education?
And I think there's always a danger of being in a bifurcation of the roles or saying these are second-class citizens or whatever. I know in my experience at Indiana, that wasn't the case at all. The faculty were faculty, and it was never looked at like you're clinical, you're tenure line, everybody voted, and my experience at LMU has been absolutely the same. I don't have, have an N of 2, but it's a possibility. And others I've heard say that very thing. Is that going to make, kind of a differentiation? And the tenure line faculty not doing any field connections. Well, we've now got clinical faculty, so we won't. So I've heard those dangers. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? I think there are implications, too, for the nature of the program. If we're hiring more that are generalists, general leadership, rather than content specialists, it does have some implications for the courses that are taught. So I think it's really a significant finding, and I don't think we probably teased out all the implications yet of what that's really going to mean. Primary strength of faculty, it pretty much is, very similar to what it's been over time. Teaching by far the most say this. I found it really interesting that the amount that said research increased slightly, but we had a big drop here on service, and we've had such a push for connections with the field. So that did not seem quite, that seemed counterintuitive to us, and we've actually are convening some focus groups to kind of look at that. How do they feel about that? Is that because they're hiring clinical faculty? And the clinical faculty they think are going to take care of the field. Not sure. The other thing that didn't seem to quite add up is that more said that research was their primary strength, but for the first time, research productivity went down. Number of articles, mean number of articles, mean number of books, etc. It went up in 86 from 72. It went up in 94. It dropped in 2008. And again, is this because we are hiring more that have been school administrators and their focus is not on research? But for whatever reason, that did go down slightly.
Martha, I have a question. Did you say that chart you just showed included the tenure track and clinical together?
Yes.
So you don't know what percentage, so 16% of that, I don't know. How the balance would come out. Okay.
Yeah.
And since you saw clinical going up.
We do have that breakdown by type. In fact, we have every breakdown there is possible, I think.
Right.
But we do have the breakdown about the clinical tended to, more of the clinical said teaching was their primary strength. Far fewer said research was. And service, a healthy percentage of the clinical did. But overall, these are the overall, including everyone.
It's surprising that it's as close then, considering the clinicals make up such a higher percentage of the total. You might have seen even more of a shift.
Even higher on the teaching.
It should have been. It might have been even higher on the teaching, given that that's primarily what clinical faculty do.
Absolutely. Or service.
Or service.
Yeah.
For those of us who aren't technically in the educational leadership field, could you give us some examples of what you mean by outreach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what we're talking about is working with the schools. It may be a study council of superintendents that represent different districts in the state, so they would work with them. They might do professional development activities for administrators out in the field. Some kind of field connections would be the outreach. So that's really a good point, because often in higher ed we think of service as maybe university service or something else, but here we're talking about service out in the field. So I'm really glad you raised that question. Yes.
How much is the, and I don't know if you have the breakdown for that, the savings to the institution in not going on the 10-year track and then hiring at a higher age, you spend less time in the 10-year track? So do you have a breakdown of that?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I don't think across academia, if you look at the data, we're hiring more, we may not be calling them clinical, contingent faculty, there are all kinds of terms that are used, but they're non-tenure line faculty. And one of the major reasons is the cost saving, because they're not making a long-term commitment. And as you point out, even to some that may be on a tenure line, if they're hiring older, they're not going to be on that tenure line for a great length of time. But there's no question that the financial consideration nationally across academia is a consideration in more non-tenure line folks.
So is that hurting or helping?
I'm sorry?
Is that hurting or helping?
Well, that's just a great question. And it depends on your perspective. And some would say it may hurt your academic programs and doing research and other things if you're not hiring people that you're making a commitment to. Others, depending on where they are on the financial aspect for the institution, may take a very different approach on that. But great question. Yeah. All right, and we did look at by time and academe, and again, I was surprised that the newer faculty were hiring. Even more say that teaching is their primary strength compared to the intermediate and the veteran, and fewer are saying research. You know, I mentioned that research productivity had gone down. Are we hiring people that are more oriented toward other things than research, which was interesting because that has not been the pattern. The last 2 studies we did, the newer faculty were more research-oriented, spent more time on research, were more productive. So we may be seeing a shift on that, and again, it's something to look at because I think that it has some implications. All right, and here's another one. I won't invite you all up because we're getting short on time, but I do want to just see if you have any thoughts on this. We're moving so much toward the generalist. And again, I already mentioned the clinical work, but overall, it was almost twice the number said leadership was their primary area of emphasis or instructional leadership compared to the last study, almost twice the number. And that means fewer are saying finance, organizational theory, law are their primary emphasis. What do you think? Are there implications there for our preparation programs when more are saying that they're generalists, leadership in general, rather than looking, at the content areas? I think it could. I think it could have implications for the kinds of courses that we offer. Thoughts on this? And this one, it's amazing. Over time, ed leadership faculty, remember, are very content lots, I'll tell you. They have gotten more so. In the 08 study, they were even more satisfied with their roles, with their programs, with their jobs, even salary. And that's usually something that faculty are not too pleased with. But ed leadership faculty, almost all of them said they'd be a faculty member again if given the opportunity. So very, very satisfied. And one thing that was disappointing to me, very few issues were identified as problems in the field. There were 4 that were noted by at least half of the faculty. Diploma mill programs, that was noted. Lack of graduate student financial support. Those students here will be glad to hear that was the one that was noted by at least half the faculty. Growing regulatory power of the state in ed leadership programs. That was noted. And the increase in online leadership preparation. Those are the only 4. Now, the low portion of faculty of color didn't quite come to the 50% mark, but it was still high. And over all these studies, that has been an area of concern. So the faculty are still concerned about the low portion of faculty of color. But only 4 items were noted by at least half of the faculty. So they really are a pretty complacent group. I don't know. Any implications? Yeah, Ernie?
So, salaries differ across universities. In general, do educational leadership faculty get higher salaries than faculty in other departments of schools of education?
I'd say in general, and again, we didn't assess other units, but I'd say in general that probably is true because many have been school administrators and they're having to compete with those kinds of salaries. So I'd say in general that is true, and so that may be one reason that they're somewhat satisfied with their salary. But why are they satisfied with their programs? Why are they satisfied with everything else is a little bit of a mystery. We did ask them to respond to a series of questions and to reflect their beliefs on things. Did they agree with this, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree? And there was a decline in the portion that thought competency standards for students are a problem. Now, you could say that's because the programs have become standards-based And so the competency standards aren't a problem anymore. Or if you're a critic, you could say, well, they just don't care. They don't think it's a problem because they're not even caring about this. So, I mean, you can look at that two ways. But more than 2/3 agreed that greater emphasis should be placed on social justice. I do think that the increase in women and minorities in leadership programs are having impact on social justice issues, equity, diversity issues, because that did come out pretty strong. Most agreed that universities should give greater rewards to service to schools, service to the field, that universities traditionally are not doing that, and they should get that. One change that came across loud and clear on both the chair and faculty surveys were that most programs at least now assert that they're standards-based ed leadership programs. Now, I've done a lot of reviewing of ed leadership programs nationally, and some assert they're standards-based and aren't really quite standards-based, but nonetheless, most assert that they are, and based usually on the Interstate School Leadership Licensure Consortium. What a mouthful. The ISLIC standards. And the one thing that is very, very positive, and I've been a critic of some of the standards that are out there, but one thing that's very positive, it has shifted the focus and put the focus on students and learning rather than on managing schools. I mean, I look at the American Educational Research Association, SIG, used to be on teaching and educational leadership. Now it's on learning and teaching and educational leadership. So this shift of the focus to put it on students, put it on learning, I think is a very positive thing we're doing. Okay, use of technology. Oh my goodness. This was a huge change from the mid-90s to 2008. 2/3 of the programs using some form, 18% entire degree programs online. So what do you think? What are the implications of this technology? This was a huge one. Anybody have any thoughts on this? Is this good? Is this bad? It's with us. That train has left the station. So what do you think?
More competition. You don't have to just look at schools in your area, so you're competing with everyone else who's online.
Absolutely, and we've got a measure in California that at least the public institutions would have to accept credit for online courses, and it's probably going to affect private institutions as well. And, so it's really changing the whole nature of the delivery system, and it's not only the way we're delivering our instruction. We are dealing with a group of students, a generation of students socialized so differently. They're socialized behind devices, behind machines. And we need more research on this. I do a lot of research on cyberbullying. And when a student is behind that computer, it's a lot different than when the person is looking someone directly in the eye. Also, many of our students never go to a library or anywhere else. They get all their information off the internet. And so just to have some standards for how to assess the quality, there are just so many technology issues that we need to address, and our faculty need to take the lead in this regard.
There are disability issues too. So I think there are disability issues too. One of my best friends basically manages special education for a nearby school district, and she's had to go through quite a number of online courses and certifications as she has been promoted and advanced in her career. But at the same time, suffering from migraines and the tendency for using a computer to trigger that kind of thing. I mean, she's really had to struggle to go through that, and I wonder if that is, what is the effect? Whereas if you go to a classroom and have a traditional education, you may or may not be quite as challenged by that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, just such an interesting point.
It seems astonishing that a master's degree or a doctoral degree in leadership could be offered without face-to-face contact in a discipline where you're managing people. I mean, that's really troubling.
Yeah. And again, some of the online course offerings are really quite good. I don't want to pan these, but to have the entire degree.
Yeah.
That way, and then you have no locale issue at all. Your students can be in Cyprus. They can be anywhere.
Yeah, and on a positive note, I think the online allows some students to express themselves in a much better way they would do in class, because maybe they are more shy or things like this. I realize always online they can say things and express.
Very good point.
Flip side too.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, Kevin?
Well, and just to kind of add to that, just having gone through the admin program here and now being in the doctorate program, we've had plenty of assignments where we have to go on Blackboard Connect, post our thoughts, and then comment on each other's thoughts. And maybe it's just the groups I travel with, but when we have to comment on each other's thoughts, we kind of read one person's thoughts, comment, and it's check, we're done. Where when we're in class, there's so much more conversation. And I know both with the admin and doctoral program, as we've gone through it, I would think almost everyone you ask, the benefit is the cohort. And we learn, I won't say more than our peers, since many of our professors are in this room. But we learn so much from interacting with our peers and talking about the day-to-day. And even if we're not in the same line of work, if someone's at a nonprofit, someone's a principal of a school, just what we learn from each other is just so valuable. And I would think, as we all kind of fill out our surveys, one of that is just being together and being face-to-face.
Great. Yeah, good point. Yes.
Just one more thing that hit me was the decline in community service. I think when you're teaching in an online program, like, what's your commitment to the community? You know, it doesn't matter. You're not maybe connected with that community at all because your students aren't in the community. Potentially they're anywhere. And so why would you be doing volunteer work with the local superintendents, or the other example that you gave?
Very good point. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the increase in the online is something that we need to really attend to. And when I meet with Ed Leadership faculty, I say, you know, this isn't flirting. You need to make a commitment to really studying this, to look at what are the implications. And we've just hit a few here, but there's so many implications, and we need to take the leadership role in devising some standards. Be leaders in devising standards, in looking at some of these things. So it's, again, wonderful dissertation topics there. All right, the last thing that I want to mention is from the chair survey, just a few data there. And again, I just want to mention that we're eroding the mean number of faculty. And it's interesting that we thought we were on the increase in 94, and then we lost the faculty. So from the 70s, we've lost 2. From the 90s, we've lost 1. Some of our professional associations have said you need 5 faculty members to have a quality program. Not even half of our programs have that many faculty. And there was a direct correlation with the programs that had the large online offerings, fewer faculty and more adjuncts. We had some programs with 18 and more. I mean, we're just showing here the mean, 3 adjuncts to 5 in 2008. But this is a significant issue, and we need to have research. Just like we need research on the technology, we need research on how are we using the adjuncts? How are we socializing them into the culture? There needs to be a lot more research on how we're using adjuncts. And we've already talked about the shift to junior ranks and the clinical roles. Well, I'll just close by noting that the challenges, the pressures from external environment on ed leadership programs have never been greater. We not only have all the accountability mandates from the state level, we have the alternative providers, whether they're for-profit or many school districts saying we're just going to grow our own. So it really is a very different climate than we've had before. Ed leadership faculty should not circle the wagons and say, well, we're, they're premier providers. That isn't going to fly anymore. what ed leadership faculty need to do is realize they're not the only game in town anymore. They need to make a commitment to take the lead in assessing all the alternatives to leadership preparation, taking the best from every sector. And some of the for-profit programs have some really good ideas, so taking the best from all sectors and ensuring that the leadership preparation we're providing is effective. Nothing less will prepare our leaders to take charge of K-12 schools and ensure that the students in those schools are prepared for the challenges of this century. Thanks.